Why, hello there! Welcome to DF Direct number 207, our weekly show where we talk about the latest in gaming and technology news. I'm John Lindemann. I'm back this week, trying to do my best to simulate the Richard Ledbetter experience. Not quite getting there, but trying my best. But I'm not alone. I'm instead here joined by two of my fellow wonderful colleagues, starting with Alex Battaglia.
Oh, wow. I wasn't expecting to go first. Yeah, John, this is a week where we got a lot of Switch news, which means I'm going to be on that mic every second talking about Switch because it's my favorite console, of course.
I know. You play that over your PC all the time. You hear about that. You won't stop talking about the Switch.
Can't stop.
But you know who else won't stop talking about the Switch? Oliver McKenzie.
Yes, to Alex's chagrin, it's a Switch week. And to Alex's further chagrin, next week is a Switch 2 week. So sorry, Alex.
Maybe I'll just get sick. We'll see. I'm going to go to like a hospital ward or something.
But Alex, Nvidia is inside both Switches. Come on now.
Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah. Okay. I'm a little bit interested then. Okay.
And by extension, it's now inside you.
Oh, okay.
So there we go. But anyway, so yes, we're all here today to talk about many great Switch-related things. And this week, the big news is that Nintendo Direct that dropped yesterday. This one is sort of the last hurrah of the original Switch, a chance for Nintendo to talk about all the things still coming to the original Switch, which they're not abandoning yet, before they get into Switch 2 territory. There were a lot of games shown, including one that at least I'm very excited about. I know Oliver is as well. It's Metroid Prime 4. After watching the trailer, though, even though it was pretty clear to us, I think, there were a lot of questions from both the audience and other viewers as, were we looking at the Switch 2 version of Metroid Prime 4? Oliver, were we looking at the Switch 2 version of Metroid Prime 4?
That's a good question. So I actually think that there's some interesting evidence in this trailer, just in terms of the way the game is constructed, in terms of the way that it appears, that can kind of give you some hints as to whether it's Switch 2 or not here. So like, if you look at the kind of general content here, we're looking at a lot of baked lighting, baked shadows. We're looking at smaller playable areas that feel kind of segmented. And ultimately, like what we're seeing here looks pretty similar to a 2023 game that we know runs on Switch 1 because it shipped on Switch 1, which is Metroid Prime Remastered. And I think one thing that really makes both these games look quite good is the lighting quality, like the very high quality pre-calculated lighting. That if indirect diffuse lighting is quite high quality, and the materials look pretty good for a Switch game, I would say here as well. But also, when you go back to that Metroid Prime Remastered, that first game, a lot of the same compromises that were present in that game are still kind of present here. Like, for instance, the player weapon when you're blasting away, there's no, like, dynamic lighting from the player weapon. There's no big light show like we saw in prior Metroid Prime games, some earlier Metroid Prime games. That is a compromise that's inherent to both titles here. And that obviously shipped on Switch 1. The environments are, again, a little bit on the smaller side, kind of static looking potentially as well. In terms of the basic metrics, there are some elements to this that are very positive, I would say, like it is a 60 FPS trailer. But again, that's the same as Metroid Prime Remastered, which was shipped on Switch 1. And in terms of the image quality, I think the game does not have like any real anti-aliasing treatment, or if there is anti-aliasing treatment, it's a pretty mild form of maybe post-process anti-aliasing possibly, but it seems like a pretty jagged, kind of raw looking game. Not that that's a bad thing necessarily, but that's how it appears. And I did some pixel counts here, and resolutions hold at about 900p or so in the shots I tested, which is again, very similar to Metroid Prime Remastered. Yep. So is it Switch 2? I would doubt it very much here. It's similar in scope and graphical appearance and visual features to a game we already have on Switch. There's no signs of, like, in particular Switch 2 features like DLSS or TAA or high-res rendering. There's no big new lighting effects or upgraded lighting or anything like that that necessarily seems like it would come from a Switch 2 upgrade here. But I think overall, the visual appearance of this trailer is like firmly in Switch 1 territory. And if it was Switch 2, I would be I'd be pretty shocked.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you on that, Oliver. And I think the key here, though, is that we shouldn't people that look at this and are like, wait, what is this? The key is that the game still looks amazing, right? Like I'm going to say this is going to stand up as one of the best looking things that ever shipped on Switch. It made us actually think about some of the prior releases on older consoles. Like when you look back at something like Halo 4 or like, really, The Last of Us, Uncharted 3 on PS3, those games that really pushed the limits of what you thought was possible on there. I think having a game with this level of visual quality running at 60 FPS in an actual decent resolution, which I would say 900p-ish is quite decent for the Switch for a 60 FPS game, that's very, very impressive. And, you know, Retro's art design is really shining through here, and I'm liking what I'm seeing in terms of the game progression, where it does seem to sort of build upon the formula of Metroid Prime. They haven't done anything radically different, but I don't think fans actually wanted something radically different. Like, no, they haven't gone open world, for instance. At least we don't think so. That would not be great. I don't think. It's open world in the Metroid way, is what I presume here, where it's a large interconnected map with very nice dense geometry to explore, some beautiful effects work, lots of nice post-processing effects in there, just to give it that nice look. But I guess the question is then, will this launch on Switch 2? And if I had to guess, I would say almost certainly. This has become a bit of a tradition for Nintendo at this point. It's not officially announced, mind you, but they love to release games right around the launch of a new console that ship on their prior generation console, games that have been announced prior for them, and then also an updated version. That I think the big one that started with was Twilight Princess back on the Wii and the GameCube. And then, of course, you know, more recently there was Breath of the Wild. So I'm not sure that Metroid has as much of a draw as Zelda, unfortunately, even though I feel it should. Yeah. But I think we will probably see this on Switch too. And because of the strong art direction and visual design, I don't think they would necessarily need to do too much to it other than massively improve image quality, basically. Yeah. I'd also wonder if, presuming that, say, the Switch 2 does support 120 frames per second output, would be interesting to see them embrace something like that as well, right? Which seems very feasible for a game designed for the original Switch. And man, I'm excited to play a new Metroid Prime game. I know you've played the originals a lot, Oliver.
Yeah.
I think Metroid Prime, I'd say, is one of my favorite games ever made. I really genuinely think it's a brilliant, brilliant piece of gaming action there. Beautiful game. Alex, I'm curious though, have you ever actually sat down and played through Metroid Prime? And whether yes or no, I'm curious about your thoughts on this.
I've played it through an emulator.
Okay.
I've played through Metroid Prime with an emulator. And I've also beaten played Metroid Prime Hunters for the DS, which I thought was really cool.
Well.
I thought it was cool.
It is different, yeah.
For the time period. It also, it doesn't have like lock-on, the Z lock-on, which I thought was cool. I'm curious to see like whether or not, like, if they bring this to Switch 2, yeah, image quality being better is nice. Probably be the biggest thing I would update from here. I actually think the texture work is surprisingly good for a Switch title. Just like looking around, like the one part when Samus is in the, like, it almost looks like a flood cavern from like Halo 4. The art design here is so much like Halo 4, it's ridiculous.
I know.
Not, what's the name of the Kevin Scott? What's the name of the Doom 3 tech artist? I forget his name, but it reminds me a little bit. Kevin Cloud, sorry. A little bit reminiscent of some of that stuff, like with the environmental design that was also in Halo 4. But when she's in there, you like look at like the grotesque, organic, like viney stuff on the wall. It's actually really pretty high res for a Switch game. Yep. I think I would like to see maybe just like better image quality, better texture filtering, and if they could, spice it up a little bit. Have like one section where there's like water on the ground. The Switch 2 can do ray tracing. Why not? Wouldn't that be cool? That'd be crazy. Yeah. I'm also curious whether or not, if they have the little mouse implement there that Switch 2 has, whether or not they would integrate that into the game at all. I don't know. We've only seen a touch of the single player here. Is it only a single player game? Is there going to be some co-op elements to it?
I doubt that, knowing Metroid's history. But you saying that brings me back to when they announced multiplayer from Metroid Prime 2, and everybody was just like, really?
I'm fine with co-op in games. I think that's cool.
They put split screen deathmatch in it though.
Deathmatch is cool. I mean, how many games actually support deathmatch these days? I'd be cool.
You know what? From a 2025 perspective, I'm on board again. It's time to revisit Metroid Prime 2's deathmatch.
Let's do it. I'll play it with you. High res shadows. I wouldn't mind that. There's a couple. Some real time shadows in here. They're a little bit low res. That's about it. But other than that, I think this was the best looking game. I would say it was also like the props, other than a couple of 2D titles, it was the best performing game we saw in the Switch.
Yeah.
Yeah, super smooth.
This ran super smooth. John, when you tested the original, the remake that was made by Retro, that was also generally a pretty super smooth game. And this looks to be much the
I think
same.
it was virtually perfect, if I recall. Prime
Yeah.
remastered.
Yeah.
It was
Which is
basically completely locked in my testing.
Oh, yeah.
So I mean, that's the thing, is just Retro Studios is really well known for
That was
hitting
an
those
Oliver video,
targets.
sorry.
Yeah. Going back to, I mean, Metroid Prime 1, 2, 3, all of those games, the Donkey Kong games, like they've always hit their frame rate targets and they always go for 60.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm glad that continues here, because, you know, that wasn't always the case with games we saw ship on Switch from first party. So yeah, Metroid Prime 4, big game, very exciting. I really want to see that on Switch 2 as well. So the other big title, at least for some of us, for some folks, a game that made me think about classic 90s shooters due to the way the world is built. It's weirdly enough, it's Pokemon ZA, I don't know, Pokemon Legends ZA, like, you know, apostrophe ZA, like pizza, something like that. It could be any of those things. This game is both significantly better visually than prior Switch Pokemon games, yet it also looks about 15 years old.
Yeah.
And Oliver, as our Pokemon man, who covers all of the Pokemon, what were your thoughts on this, and how does it compare to the prior entries?
Yeah, so I actually think this looks, by recent Pokemon standards, it looks sort of okay. Like, just the way that it looks like at a glance, it looks like a plausible city. You know, you look around, there are buildings, the draw distance isn't like obnoxious, there are shadow maps, it kind of looks sort of in its place, it looks okay. And I think you really do have to go back to Scarlet and Violet to really get a sense of the visual progression between Pokemon titles here, because that game really just did look quite awful. I think a lot of the problems came down to scope, like the textures could be very low resolution. There was a lot of texture tiling, especially in the environments when you're looking at like distant buildings, sure, but distant bits of terrain, there was like super obvious, just ugly repeated textures everywhere. There was some like pretty ugly normal mapping on buildings, very low resolutions there. Very awful draw distance, I would say, with a lot of pop-in and a pretty bad use of like reduced rate animations as well. So you'd like have characters that were maybe, you know, 20 feet, 30 feet afield, and they'd be running at like quarter rate, or flags that were rendering and were animating at like 2 frames per second, 2 cycles per second, whatever. It just, obviously the Switch is CPU and all this stuff, it makes sense, but like it was just so jarring in that context of an open world Pokemon game. But I think in part because of the scope of Z to A, and in part because of probably some better art decisions and probably some technical upgrades as well, a lot of those issues aren't evident. Like there is a lot of plain texture tiling, but it's for elements like building sections and windows and things like that, where it's kind of natural, it's not obnoxious, it looks fine. The textures tend to be a little bit higher resolution here. Maybe there's, you know, some repetition there, but they do look pretty high resolution, they do look pretty good. The quality of the art in general looks, I would say, a lot better than in Scarlet or Violet. Pop-in isn't as much of a problem. Like in some of these scenes, even though it's a city area, you can actually see grass that's drawing further afield, a lot further afield than in Scarlet and Violet, which actually makes some of those more naturalistic like park areas inside of the city look better to the eye there. The NPCs are drawing further, and I went through this trailer very carefully and I couldn't spot any signs of like reduced rate animation, which is a big issue in Scarlet and Violet that's not present here, at least not present in these kind of curated shots. Now in the final game, maybe we'll get a bit of a different impression there, but at least it doesn't seem to be as big of an issue. But yeah, I think ultimately this looks better because of a change in art style, a little bit, a change in setting, and being shown in a curated trailer. But like John kind of mentioned, there are some big issues with it in terms of, yeah, we can kind of highlight the improvements, but there are some big issues. Probably the biggest issue to me is just like the buildings, which are composed of very little actual geometry. Like even at like LOD 0, if there is a LOD system for those buildings, they're really flat. like super flat, unbelievably flat, like just a couple polygons there, it looks like.
Dude,
Yeah.
that's the thing, is like watching this trailer, especially when you get to like 2 minutes 14 seconds, I have this like flash where I'm like, man, this looks like a Sandy Peterson map from Doom 2 or like Rise of the Triad, where you just have these like large, tall, flat surfaces representing buildings stretching way up into the sky, which is the same repeating texture slathered across it.
Yeah.
It's a very specific look that feels weirdly claustrophobic. It looks like 90s style, like shooter geometry.
Yeah.
It's a sector-based shooter or something.
To me, it really
Which is
felt
funny.
like one of those remasters of a PlayStation 2 title or a 3DS title or a title from a more distant generation like that, where you just have like the model geometry is basically unchanged, but they've kind of slathered high resolution art over everything. And it just looks like there's a bit of a discordance between the relatively, image quality that's better, texture quality that's better, but geometry that's like super plain and super boxy and looks like out of a game from 20 years ago easily, right? It's just very bizarre.
Yeah,
Dude, it straight up reminds me of Midnight Club 1 on the PlayStation 2.
Yeah.
So
yeah. I
I know you're going to play it, Alex. What do you think?
I'm going to play this game, as we all know. But, I'm happy Oliver did detail areas where it is artistically more sound than the previous entries, specifically, and how there wasn't great evidence of animation decimation in the distance, which I thought looked... there were a couple of examples. I remember a video that Tom did was also really bad once. But here, the one thing that it does bother me a bit is that every single shot, we're not going to run this through our tools, I don't think, but every single shot was really dropping tons of frames. So none of they do a lot of what almost looks like manual developer cam pans of the city where someone just like hit left on the stick or right on the stick. And each one of those is unsmooth. And we're talking about a 30 FPS base presentation, so that means we're seeing frame drops into the 20s. Given the art and everything and the plainness of it all, that is a bit of a shame, especially when I watched these back to back with the Metroid Prime trailer. So it was really jarring from a performance standpoint, also texture quality standpoint, where Metroid Prime seemed like way ahead. But there are some aspects of this which make it heavier to run. It is a large open city, even if simple, and it also does use real-time shadows everywhere, it looks like. Which is not something the Switch is probably very good at in general anyway. It just seems like mainly characters and buildings and some smaller objects. Obviously, stuff like grass doesn't get shadows. But yeah, or even some like, I'm looking at this bridge here. It doesn't even have shadows. So but still, I just think I would really love to see. I know people are saying that they've been taking more time on these games, but there's still aspects of them where I find them like questionable as to why it's running the way it is.
There's also just still some awkward stuff with like, I think the animation is kind of poor quality and characters are kind of snapping around, and that doesn't look too great either.
No, it doesn't.
In terms of performance, the performance is not good, like Alex mentioned. But also the image quality is kind of questionable. It looks like maybe a post AA, maybe something in there, but the counts I was getting, which presumably come from the game in docked mode, were coming in around 720p, which is, not, again, it's Switch One. What can you say? But it's not ideal, I'd say. And I am pretty confident this is Switch One. I don't think anyone is saying this is possibly on Switch 2. I'd probably expect this would arrive on Switch 2, but it would probably have some high-res rendering, maybe a 60 FPS mode. Hopefully they're able to clean up some of these issues. But yeah, in general, Game Freak and the Switch One are not really a match made in heaven, especially with some of these newer titles that have more expanded scope rather than just like the remasters and remakes of their older titles. And I think that this shows some evidence of that friction still, even if it is like not as bad. Like it is considerably improved over their prior 2022 title. Yeah.
I mean, I actually quite like the character models in this. I think
that's a high
expressive.
Point.
The sort of textured on face where they like blink eyes and have expressions as they, emote. Mm-hmm. I think that generally looks pretty good. And the Pokemon themselves are all well modeled. So they have the base assets looking nice there. It's just those environments are still rather poor. I mean, I genuinely look at this and it feels like a mid-budget game designed for like the first year of PS3.
Yeah.
You know, it just has that
Yeah.
look to it, especially when you add in like the way the textures work with those like very obvious normal maps combined with the super low res shadow maps. I just feel like we actually saw better looking stuff even during that initial year of the Xbox 360.
Oh yeah,
Like
by far.
stylistically, they're worlds apart, but you look at something like Ghost Recon Advanced Warfighter Raw, which had a gigantic city map with shadow maps and everything, and that looked so much more technically impressive even today than this. Even though, again, stylistically, they're very, very different. And that's just kind of that's a bit of a bummer that they've never been able to wrap their heads around this and sort of figure this out. So it is what it is, though. I mean, like you said, Oliver, despite these shortcomings, it does ultimately look better than the previous games in many ways. And it also seems like it might run better despite the constant performance hiccups evident in the trailer. So I will say this, like stylistically, if they were able to boost the res and frame rate significantly on a Switch 2, it will be a reasonably nice looking game. Nothing impressive, but it will like not be an ugly looking experience, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
They could at least somewhat rescue it. But when you look in the context of the Switch or even Wii U, like you look at Breath of the Wild, for instance, which is still like light years beyond this, or even I was just playing it for a video, Xenoblade Chronicles X, which is so far beyond what they've done here.
Oh my goodness.
All the right, and that was initially also a Wii U game, and now we have it on Switch running at a much higher resolution, often around 1080p even, and it's just, yeah, these guys, I don't know, it's very, very strange. But that's the life of developing Pokemon. You're beholden to the release schedule of whatever the Pokemon company defines, I guess, and you just have to crank this stuff out. And they've never had the chance to really rebuild their tools in a meaningful way to produce better results. So here we are. So we're going to talk about a few other games here, and then as the next topic, we're going to get to one of the more interesting things that was revealed that's not a game specifically. So first of all, two of the surprises during the Direct, for me at least, were announced Patapon 1 and 2 replay and Everybody's Golf Hot Shots. So these are both Sony properties originally. So obviously Everybody's Golf Hot Shots was a PlayStation 1 game, a series that continued for a while. It continued for a long time by the developer Clap Hands, which does not appear to be involved with this game because they were busy doing their own new golf game on the Quest platform in VR. So this is not the original studio, but it's still interesting to see them bring it back. And then Patapon, of course, was well known on the PSP as a very cool sort of musical strategy game, if you will. Very curious little series that still has a very nice visual identity, I think, that holds up real well on the Switch. So I think it's cool to see those arriving here on Nintendo's platform, and I'm curious what kind of deals happen to make that possible and what this means in the future for what were essentially like Sony developed or Sony published games being revived and worked on by other companies or appearing on other platforms, right?
Right.
Yeah. Freedom Wars.
That's cool.
Also, I just found out the other day.
That's a good point.
Yeah, it was published. They published a remastered version for PS4, PS5, Switch even, and PC, I believe, back just in January by Bandai Namco. That's pretty cool. Obviously, a kind of a late period PS Vita game that I quite enjoyed. That
it was like a sci-fi Monster Hunter-y kind of game.
Yeah, that is apparently part of this push too. So hopefully we'll see more older titles, maybe some, who knows, PS3 era, PS2 era titles coming out of this kind of collaboration there potentially.
I would love to see that. That would be really cool. Another one on the list here that I think, Oliver, you put in there is Tomodachi Life, Living the Dream. I don't care about this series, but I'm curious to hear what you have to say.
Yeah. Well, this was a little bit curious because, you know, when I was watching this live, it certainly seemed like, okay, well, if they're if they're showing off Pokemon mid-presentation, and especially Metroid Prime 4 mid-presentation, like that was a big meaty slice of both titles there. Certainly the title they close with is going to be a barnstormer, right? But instead, I was left with Tomodachi Life, which, I mean, I can't say that I'm terribly familiar with this series, but just judging from this trailer and judging from what people have to say about it, I don't think it's like my number one potential series here. And this trailer, I mean, it looks fine. There are some pretty bad frame rate drops, curiously enough.
Yep.
Yeah, that was weird.
That was a little bit strange. It seems like it looks colorful. It looks exciting. I'm sure people who are fans of this series will like what's being shown here. I certainly saw a lot of excitement online. But from my perspective, it does not seem like anything that's that special necessarily from a technical perspective. I don't know what you guys think.
I mean, this gives me kind of worse running the tourist vibes.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
That's kind of like the tourist.
Yeah.
It's like an uglier, choppier The Tourist.
Yeah, so that's what I kind of felt about it. But I was just mainly confused about the performance because there's like these scenes where it's like 30, 30, 30, and then all of a sudden it's like 15.
Looks like double buffered almost even.
Yeah. So maybe that's what we're seeing. And that wouldn't be, there's been a number of double buffered games on Nintendo Switch for some reason. Who really can know why, but yeah.
Input latency and memory, maybe.
Yeah. Just speaking of performance in general, I just want to, people know I have a complex history with HD 2D, but the Dragon Quest 1 and 2 HD remakes, the one thing that really stood out for me beyond the graphics, which I don't want to comment about because I already have opinions about that people have talked about, was that it was 30 FPS. And so when you put all these complex post-processing effects on a Switch, it's hard to get them running. I would presume at a high quality where it's consistent with the art and all these things. There's like shadow maps everywhere, constant depth of field, which is expensive on a GPU with limited bandwidth, extremely limited bandwidth. So that's like a 30 FPS presentation for what is ostensibly a 2D game. Now,
Alex, just to chime in there, that is a game that's also on other consoles and the PC, right? So the Switch version is essentially the port.
Okay, so maybe I would say cut out the stuff that makes it run at 30 would be my opinion. But then you go to later on, and there's this Witchbrook game, which looks like an RPG Maker game almost. But, it's like very consistent art style, pixel art, perhaps even to the same pixel density as what we saw in HD 2D. But it's like 60. And I don't know. I just kind of, when I see 2D characters moving around in, pseudo 3D environments, etc., at 30 FPS, it always feels like it's a miss. So yeah, I'm hoping Switch 2 gets rid of this issue of games that have modern post-processing having to run almost usually at 30 FPS.
I think, as we know, the thing about the Switch and any console really is that 60 FPS is always a design choice, right? And the developer needs to make that from the beginning and target all of their, the vision for the project needs to keep that in mind from the beginning. And depending on what your capabilities are as a developer, you need to figure out what you can and cannot support within that 16 millisecond window. So you look at like Retro Studios, for instance, all the decisions they made with Metroid Prime 4. I mean, you would know that from the very beginning, they're like, okay, we're hitting 60 FPS and everything we develop for this, every shader, every piece of art has to be made with this target in mind.
Yeah.
And it requires that sort of like dedication. So yes, the Switch is a very weak piece of hardware in 2025, but you can do great looking stuff with it if you take the time and plan for it properly and scale your game appropriately. Obviously, that becomes more difficult when you're talking about ports. Like you mentioned, Dragon Quest, that is, of course, running on other platforms as well. And they want to try to get that looking as similar as possible. So there's more limitations there. But when you're making an original Switch game, that's the thing. That said, there was still some other nice looking games in here as well that I think, like, I love that Shadow Labyrinth game. That is the weirdest thing. I mean, you saw that, right? It's like evil Pac-Man or Dark Pac-Man in like a 2D side-scrolling adventure game. And knowing that Nintendo requires Switch footage for the Direct, by the way, at least it seems to be 60 FPS on the Switch, which is cool.
Yeah.
But it is a 2D looking game. So that's kind of interesting, I thought. Um, there's of course Disney Villains Cursed Cafe. No, we don't need to talk about that.
Oh
uh,
gosh.
okay, one for me that I really have to mention, and I know you guys probably don't have much of a history with this series, but it's the Gradius Origins collection that was announced. So this seems to be produced by M2, the legendary developer known for bringing classic stuff back, as well as some original properties. And in typical M2 fashion, they have a special surprise. So not only does it include like all the Gradius Life Force Salamander like series in there, all those arcade games, all these different variants, all the different region variants, like it's very, very significant in terms of what they're including here, which is awesome. But they've also developed, and they just like randomly dropped it in there, Salamander 3. Salamander itself has always been kind of an offshoot of the Gradius series, and 1 and 2, I love those games. They're great, especially 2. It's a very cool game. Came out in like mid 90s on the Konami GX arcade board. And then the series, that just kind of went silent. And here's M2 coming along, just like, yeah, we're just gonna make a sequel to that. And that's what they've done. So now we have Salamander 3. And it looks awesome, I think. So I'm really happy to see them get a chance to be able to make that. It is kind of in the model of the Rebirth series back on the Wii that M2 was known for. Like Castlevania Rebirth, Contra Rebirth, and Gradius Rebirth, where it's like their sort of vision for like a sequel using still 2D pixel art, but kind of pushing it to the next level in terms of what they're doing with effects and scaling and everything. So I think that's really cool. I have pre-ordered the physical version already from Japan because I need this. The other one I wanted to very, very quickly mention, just as like highlighting it, weirdly enough, is Marvel Cosmic Invasion. Now you'd be like, John, why are you talking about a Marvel thing at this point? Like, isn't that all kind of over? I know you were like that, Alex.
No, yeah, I was like, why are we talking about this? But here we are.
That's because this is the next game from Tribute Games that created Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Shredder's Revenge, which I would say is weirdly enough, one of the best brawlers ever made.
Mm-hmm.
It's extremely good. I absolutely love the game. And this is essentially like a follow-up to that. So, we might be over the Marvel thing, but I trust these guys to do right by brawler aficionados and deliver something that's beautiful, fun, and it will probably sound great. I assume, hopefully, they probably get T. Lopes again on the soundtrack. I hope so anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And, Marvel has a history with these sort of like pixel art action games, whether brawling, fighting, Capcom did a bunch, Konami did some, and they were great, right? I think Marvel always shines in this sort of like 2D pixel art style. So that's definitely one to watch. As for the rest, though, was there any other games that stuck out to you guys that you wanted to mention, or was that it?
Not especially.
No,
all right. Well, there are 2 more things, though, to discuss in here. First of all, I see on the docket there's mention of the Switch 2 C button. And we have Oliver here with the hot scoop on that. So, Oliver, tell us all about the Switch 2 C button.
Yeah, well, I regret to say there's not a whole lot I can tell you about the Switch 2 C button. Basically, this leaked in some imagery that was published in the Nintendo Today app, which I think we'll talk about in a moment potentially. But yeah, there is a C icon on that kind of blank-faced button that we saw in the earlier Switch 2 renderings, where Nintendo did not want to inform you of the iconography on that button, and now they have. But I'm very curious to see what this will be used for, because like the N64 had 4 C buttons, the GameCube had a C stick, and I think the Wii also had a C button on the triggers, if I'm not mistaken, something like that. But I'm really curious to see what the C stands for, if it's like camera or cursor is one possibility I've seen floated that would potentially tie into mouse functionality with the Switch. You still have the capture button on the left-hand Joy-Con, so presumably it's not being used for that purpose there. But the fact that Nintendo has put so much effort into keeping this under wraps, presumably the plan was to keep it under wraps until the April 2nd Switch 2 Direct event. here suggests that it's probably something fairly important. And I would think that it's probably something to do with some key toggle the system has, and not something that is just like usable by developers to map like your punch button onto. I think the placement suggests something very much of a toggle kind of nature there.
It's like a system level function for sure. They wouldn't put it there otherwise, right? So it's probably not a copy button because I don't see a paste button. But I am curious what they're going to do with that. And yeah, very, very interesting. We haven't seen C buttons since, I guess it was like GameCube, if I recall.
Yeah, you had a C stick on the GameCube.
C stick. N64 had the C buttons, and back then C stood for camera. Presumably this does not stand for camera, because I don't believe there is a camera on board on the Switch 2 anyway, and we already have a right stick, so I don't know. Very, very strange thing, but thanks for that update, Oliver. We know more about it. But you mentioned another keyword. The Nintendo Today app was announced at the end of the Direct.
Yeah.
And I believe you spent a little bit of time with it. And I guess the question everyone has is, you played with Nintendo today, but will you be doing it tomorrow?
That's a good question. Well, it really depends on the kinds of content they have for me. But anyways, I have the little Nintendo Today app open here. And it's kind of an interesting part of the Switch marketing cycle, I guess you could say. It seems like a way to kind of drip feed players information about Switch titles. And it's actually kind of, I don't know, I kind of find it kind of charming. Like, you boot it up and you basically get to pick your theme. So you get to pick between like Zelda or Mario or Animal Crossing or Splatoon or Pikmin, which is interesting. No Metroid theme, which is what I might have gone with, but I went with the Legend of Zelda theme. And it kind of themes your app with iconography, app icons, graphics, stuff like this that matches that selection. And there's like a countdown for the Switch 2 Direct, which you can see there. I think it's a pretty kind of cool way to update people on Switch 2 game information and kind of, I don't know, put players in more of a continuous mode of like expecting updates and upgrades and things like that, which is kind of more in line with like modern game conventions where old games get patched all the time, or you have like live service titles and continuous update practices and things like that. So I think it's kind of a cool little app. But if I have a complaint, at the moment, it really does seem to focus on video content. Like, you click any of these links here and it opens up into like a trailer or like a snippet of an orchestral piece or something like that. It's not really something that is like integrated with like a news feed. Like the PlayStation blog is maybe a good counterexample where it's basically focused on text and there is a video component. Here it seems focused on video component, and maybe in the future there will be a text component. I would prefer it if like each time you clicked on a link, it came up with a little article, a little summary, a little bit of PR, and then there was also a video, so I could evaluate whether I'm interested in watching the video. You know, just a little quibble there. Also, the video quality is kind of low, but in classic Nintendo fashion, we're always struck by the generally low quality of the video they serve over YouTube with their 1080p 60 encodes there. Hopefully that will change for Switch 2. This Direct had quite poor footage quality, although we did manage to snag a few copies of higher quality versions of certain trailers from Nintendo servers, which is certainly helpful. But yeah, I think this app is cool. I'm interested to see how it evolves. For now, though, it's very much like a work in progress. They need to kind of push out more content and do more interesting things with it.
I feel like my thoughts on this really come down to Nintendo sort of wanting to further their sort of like direct marketing strategy, right? Especially in an age where social media platforms are becoming increasingly fragmented and crazy. And, you know, perhaps this is their way of sort of creating something that goes directly to players, completely ignoring all of that. And they actually have a history with this, because the whole Nintendo Direct format, and in fact, you know, we're using the name Direct for the DF as well, right? They were the first of these big companies to sort of like go against the grain and create a program that directly targets all the consumers in a way that was different from the typical press conference that we would see at like E3 and the like, right? They developed this whole strategy, and this feels like a potential next step. I don't know if they'll be entirely successful with it, but it's almost like a miniaturized social media network with the safe Nintendo guardrails that allows people to sort of like pop in and potentially see what's happening new on Switch. And if they spin it right, perhaps it's a way to encourage customers like, oh yeah, I'm interested in seeing what's new on the Switch or the Switch 2. And they may pop it open, look on there, and see if there's anything cool or interesting to find. So whether they will actually pull that off, it's not clear. But yeah, I don't know. I think that's where they're going with it.
Yeah.
So, well, that's pretty much the Nintendo Direct, except for one thing, which is our next topic. At the Nintendo Direct this week, Nintendo announced something called virtual game cards. And this thing is very interesting because it is designed to, at least from my perspective, solve a couple of problems with the way that digital games work on most platforms, but especially on Nintendo platforms. Here's the current gist. When you have a Switch, you can activate one Switch as your primary console. That primary console, like on PlayStation 5 and like on Xbox, you can download games that your account owns to that console. And as long as it is already registered with Nintendo servers being the primary console, all digital games can be played offline, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the current setup for it. The problem there is if you have multiple Switches, whether it's you personally having multiple Switches, like I think we all do, or if you're in a family environment where, you know, your children or your wife or even friends have their other Switch and you want to either access your own games on there or want to give access to a family member. But to do so currently would require you to give your user information to them. They log in with it, download the game. They can only play it on the owner's account, right? Mm-hmm. And you need to be connected online to do it. So for me personally, the problem that arises is if I take the Switch with me and it's not the primary one, like the Switch Lite, for instance, you can't play on an airplane, can't play at hotels, you usually can't connect to the Wi-Fi there anyway, because they have those like sort of like intranet welcome screens that you need to access in order to connect to the Wi-Fi, which basically meant any digital games that you had, if you didn't have your primary Switch, were unavailable. You could not run them at all. And that sucks, right? So the idea here, though, is they sort of start this section by talking about with a traditional game cartridge, you can take the cartridge out, put it into a different Switch. Now that person's playing it while you're playing something else on your original Switch. And you're basically trading these things back and forth, right? Mm-hmm. That's what they're proposing, but on a digital side. They've implemented what looks like a sort of like additional menu along the bottom of the system now, right next to the settings menu by default there, which allows you to assign virtual game cards, which is essentially you're taking your digital games, your digital purchases, and tagging it as like, here's this virtual version of a game cartridge. And if you're within that group, if you basically have to connect online once to register that console as like part of this group. But once you've connected and traded the game card or allowed access to the game card, it's now fully playable offline on a different Switch. So that, I think, is the big thing there. In addition, they also seem to be offering something to lend games. So like you can actually lend it to so you can load it on another system or lend the game to a different system without having to give them your user details. Mm-hmm. So you could say, all right, I'm going to let you play my copy of Super Mario Brothers Wonder, as they show there, lend it to a family member. The lend mode seems to allow access to the game for 2 weeks, I think they said.
14 days, yeah.
14 days. So it's essentially like a temporary loan program, sort of like lending them the actual cartridge. So while it is still fundamentally limited by the fact that servers are involved here, which you'd expect from a digital game, of course, it does seem to be making strides in terms of allowing a little more flexibility in terms of how users access these different games. Not quite on the level of something like the early days of PS3, where you could like register like 6 systems and share games all over the place until Sony clamped down on that. But it's certainly better than the current system if you're somebody that needs offline access or you want to lend to other family members. But Oliver, you actually spotted something sort of curious at the end here related to enabling this feature, right?
I did. So Nintendo is curiously a little bit non-specific about certain details of this program, including like certain details that I don't know have not been made clear to me. Like, will all games be covered under this program? Will it apply to all the old purchases as well as new ones? But there was one detail that's a little bit curious that did pique my attention. At the end of the trailer for the virtual game card, they say, by navigating to user settings, online license settings, and turning the setting to on, you can instead opt to connect to the internet to start up software. So it sounds like this might not be a system that is in addition to the existing system of being able to log in to other Switches and play games on it, but it might be a system that is exists independent of that system, and you have to pick one or the other potentially there, which would be interesting. Certainly, the way this system works, it could be pretty elegant. It could work out pretty well. I have more concerns on the user interface side of things. Like, is it possible for me to send all my virtual game cards to another console at once, right? Do I have to do it one by one? Do I have to parcel it out very carefully between systems? That could be a sticking point. Nintendo often, with their user interfaces, doesn't really provide like a way to like select multiple items there in a list or organize things in a really convenient way. You know, this could be hopefully handled better than some of those elements there. But I think one thing that I really do like about the system is that account management between consoles is kind of a little bit opaque, a little bit impenetrable, a little bit complicated. And this simplifies it by giving you a simple real world phenomena to kind of think of, right? Which is the phenomenon of lending out a game. It makes intuitive sense to lend out a game to someone. Give it to them, you don't have access to it, then you have it back. That makes a lot of sense. In terms of sharing between multiple Switches, I think this is probably a preferable solution for a device like the Switch because you don't always have an internet connection. That is a key element of existing kind of console splitting, console sharing systems, unlike the PS5, Series X, Series S, and the existing Nintendo Switch. But that obviously doesn't really work as well for the Switch paradigm, so I agree that is an improvement. But I'd just be really curious to see how this actually works in practice. If you do have to select the system as opposed to the old system, that could be a bit of a headache potentially. And if the interface is actually intuitive enough and easy enough to use, that this will seem like a pretty natural and easy thing to do. Because if you're swapping games between Switch units all the time, it might be kind of a hassle if you're selecting every single individual game on a Switch card or on an SD card, which could have, hundreds of games on it quite easily these days.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's actually a couple questions here from supporters that I wanted to read and get into here. First one comes from Dejako Dan. He says, what do you think of Nintendo's new virtual cart system for time-limited digital game lending? It seems like a smart move from their perspective to try and incentivize more digital sales. However, I'm curious if this is a first step and how it will evolve over time. Personally, I feel like this is a step towards digital resale. Imagine you could rent your games digitally to a friend and Nintendo takes a cut, or you choose to sell it entirely, but perhaps limited to a single release, and Nintendo still takes a cut. If digital could enter the free market of used sales somehow, as well as being free to be written to any storage medium for preservation, might then it finally be the death knell for physical games? And then also from Todd Weitzel, he says, I love John's comments on Nintendo virtual game cards compared to the infamous Xbox disc sharing slides from E3. Wow. So both of these kind of tie into the fact that I think this is still very much a different thing. So the disc sharing thing that was shown at E3 that Xbox proposed was actually something that would have applied sort of digital license management to discs as well. So it was like everything under a single umbrella, rather than sort of separating them out still. I don't think Nintendo's going that way. And in fact, while I could foresee them potentially getting into that whole selling thing, maybe, like at least the route is there for it. I don't feel like that's something we would see anytime soon. And it does sound rather non-Nintendo, to like get into this sort of like marketplace stuff where users, you know what I mean? Because the only way I could see it is if like man, but how would you even? So that opens up so many problems, right? Like you couldn't just give the user back like normal currency. It would probably have to be in Nintendo points or whatever for the eShop bucks, space bucks. But furthermore, how do you determine the correct price for something? Right? There is no scarcity with digital games, and games tend to get cheaper over time when scarcity is not part of the equation, right? So like, how do you determine what you sell it for?
Yeah.
I don't know.
I've always felt
They
like
could
one of the fundamental trade-offs of going digital only or largely digital, as I generally have over the past 2 console generations, is that you don't have access to kind of reselling, sharing these kinds of features. I think the virtual game card feature is a very intriguing way to share games between friends. That is pretty cool. But outside of that, I would not be expecting any kind of like rental arrangement, bizarre things like that.
The thing is, though, and this is specifically true with Nintendo, whether you plan to sell them or you're just a collector and you have physical games for Nintendo platforms, in almost all cases, those games appreciate in value, right? You go back to the Wii U. If you bought all of your games physically for Wii U and then a friend of yours bought all of them digitally, the person that bought them all physically is now sitting on an increased value, a pile of games that now is largely worth more than they were when you bought them new, or at least similar values. And they're only going up, especially specific titles where the prices have continued to climb. Especially, like obviously there's cases off to the side, right? Like I picked up the US version of Devil's Third when it came out. It was a very low print run. If somebody just bought that digitally, it's just sitting on your Wii U. If you bought that game physically, then you're sitting on something that's worth like $500 now.
Oh my God.
Right? So for Nintendo platforms specifically, there is this thing to consider where it's like, yeah, well, if I'm spending the same amount of money, why wouldn't I take the thing that I could, one, resell if I chose, but also two, is, likely to become much more valuable long term, and you have full ownership control over it that doesn't rely on Nintendo servers at all. So there's still, I feel like it doesn't solve any of those problems. It's just like a more enjoyable way to allow people to work within the constraints of their digital library on the Switch.
Mm-hmm.
So, gosh, imagine buying all your games digitally on the Wii U, though, guys.
That would have been.
Ooh. Yeah, man, not a good time. And I don't think Nintendo's going to get rid of physical cards anytime soon, because they do target such a broad audience, and I think having a store presence behooves them, especially when you see, like, you go to Japan where, like, game stores are still physical game shops. It's still super common. They're all over the place. Switch has a gigantic market presence there. It's hugely successful. And you see those games, those physical games all over the place. You take that away and you're basically just handing off, free marketing to whoever else wants to come and fill the void, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think Nintendo wants to get rid of this. I think they still want to be the place to go where parents buy the game and put it under their Christmas tree, or, the birthday kid gets a new Switch game. They want to be in the store when grandma's shopping. They want that retail presence where you're just physically out and about and you see the Switch games there. I think that's very important to them, and I don't think they want to get rid of that anytime soon. So, especially Xbox is done in that space. They're over. Which is not good, and I think PlayStation eventually is going to head that way, which is a shame as well. Which would mean that Nintendo would essentially have the retail market entirely to themselves. So at that point, why the heck would they want to throw that away? I just don't think they would.
Yeah.
We're not done with the Switch news, though. We've got another topic on Switch. One more. Sorry, Alex.
Yeah, I know. It's just like, wait, what?
I feel your pain.
Okay, I'm here. Whew.
The next topic. Switch 2 3-phase rollout. Let that roll off the tongue. The 3-phase rollout. I know, Alex, you're
I don't even know what's going on anymore. Yeah.
So this is essentially, there was some talk about this. I guess Rich posted a link here from Insider Gaming, where it's sort of getting into this idea that Nintendo is currently targeting 3 distinct windows for launching Switch 2 games, with the initial launch window being focused primarily on first-party games. October, November working for third-party studios, which many of which do not yet have development hardware. And he says here that they expected to get them by June. And we'll talk about GDC later, but based on a lot of the things I've heard, it also seems like many developers are still without kit. So they are very slow at rolling this out to a lot of developers. And then there's the third phase, which is the holiday period, which I guess, I mean, they say October, November is second stage. So I guess December, final, whatever. But Oliver, what do you think about this? And what does this mean to you for the Switch 2's first year on the market?
That's a good question. I think when you look at what Nintendo has done with the Switch 1 over the course of its life cycle, they've been really, really good at pacing out games over the system's life cycle. Every few months, they've had a significant release, or, every year they've had a couple big releases, typically. This report basically suggests kind of a similar kind of rollout, albeit something that is planned into distinct phases. But here, the only real detail that I am a little bit curious about is the suggestion that third-party partners won't be getting dev kits until June, and I think that's been kind of maybe misinterpreted in some circles. I would expect that a lot of third-party partners currently have their hands on Switch 2 hardware and are working diligently on games, but probably a lot of developers won't get their hands on hardware, a lot of smaller developers, I'd imagine, until June, which is presumably around the launch of the console, to prevent leaks and things like that, I'd presume mostly here. So yeah, I would assume that a lot of developers have been working on games for a long time at this point, but I'm excited. I'm really excited for Switch 2. I'm not going to hide that I'm really excited for Switch 2. I'm hoping that first year, we're going to see hopefully Switch 2 versions of Pokemon, hopefully Switch 2 versions of Metroid Prime 4. I'd hope for that. I'd hope as well, I think we are going to see Mario Kart this year as well. And I'd hope for maybe one or two other kind of wild cards in the mix as well. And then for like 2026, maybe a 3D Mario, a few other games of interest there, and for them to continue to fill the schedule in kind of a predictable way in Nintendo fashion, with probably a mix of Switch 1 titles that are being upgraded for Switch 2, new Switch 2 games, new franchises, hopefully a lot of returning favorites and big heavy hitters that we are expecting at some point, like in the distant future, hopefully a new 3D Zelda and all this other good stuff that we really like to see from Nintendo. So I'm really excited for it. The number one game with a Switch 2 life cycle for me, probably the entire life cycle, but certainly the initial part of the life cycle, is that new Mario Kart. I'm really excited for that. But I think Nintendo will probably have a pretty strong launch lineup, as they tend to do. They tend to have really good paced, a really well paced lineup of titles for their systems, for sure.
Absolutely. I think you're spot on with that. I wouldn't be surprised if we saw Mario Kart as a launch title, maybe even Metroid. I don't know.
Yeah.
At least Metroid might be within that first phase. And then I would expect something from like EAD or one of the main developers within Nintendo internal to have something for like the fall holiday period, similar to what it was with Mario Odyssey, right?
Yeah.
Where maybe they revealed that around the launch. It's like, yeah, coming later this year. And I think you're right. I think there will be third-party games early on, of course. It just seems like a lot of medium to small developers still do not have access to development hardware. So Nintendo has been very selective with who they allow to do it. Although I do hope that initial group includes Nintendo's longtime partner, the Munich-based Shinen, who did Fast RMX and The Tourist, as you mentioned earlier, Alex. They're all, man, those guys are so good, and they've only gotten better with age. And I really hope that they have a launch title for us, or at least a first year Switch 2 title. It feels like they would. It's been a while since the Punch Win, which was an awesome game, by the way. Oh yeah, Alex is like, wait, what is that?
Yeah,
Dude,
what is that?
it's incredible.
It's pretty cool.
It's so good. It's really good. So I really hope we see something from them. But
yeah,
this all sounds reasonable, I think, and it does seem to mirror what they did with the original Switch in terms of how they roll out software. So gosh, I can't wait to just see. I just want more info here. I want to see some of this stuff. And we're very close. We're so close.
I really
very
can't
close.
wait. And I also expect, because I we kind of tend to think that the Switch 2 hardware has probably been ready in some form for quite a while. We know they were showing it off to various partners, various developers with their various demos of Zelda and The Matrix Awakens and things like this. Back 2 years ago, in some cases, like the Bobby Kotick said that he saw some presentation for Switch 2 back in 2022. So this is a long way going back. Hopefully, what they've been doing in the interim is a lot of development for the new system, and in particular, planning up that crucial kind of 6-month launch window in which the console becomes established in players' minds. They get that crucial first holiday season. They're selling through all the units they can put out there. They're getting a ton of press, and all indications I'm seeing so far are that I think Nintendo will stick the landing on this console for that early period. I think they're going to have a lot of high-quality software this year on both Switch 1 and also, of course, on Switch 2 with some hopefully big exclusives like Mario Kart. Again, I cannot express how excited I am for that, but also for many other titles, I'm sure, on Switch 2.
And then we can get the Switch 3 hype train rolling.
Mm-hmm.
But that's going to do it for Switch and Switch 2 talk this week. Alex, we're finished.
Yeah, thank you. I obviously had so much to say during all of that. So
our
thank
next
you,
topic,
audience.
though, our next couple topics, at least, are much more up your alley. So let's get to them. The next one is simply Witcher 4 out post 2026. Will it be next gen? ? Alex.
Yeah. I would definitely say this is not too surprising. A Witcher game is a large open worlds with a lot of variability in how you complete quests and all these other things. And it's probably, given the way the video game industry works, it's going to be bigger and better in all those ways. Textures are ridiculous, etc. Models are ridiculous. And that all takes a lot of human labor to make. So I'm not surprised about the timing of this, especially considering the Cyberpunk expansion was not too far away in the past now. Which required a lot of hands-on. The one thing, though, about it being next-gen is I think that is also very reasonable because currently, with what we know with the Witcher 4's PC version, it's going to be targeting feature sets that are quite a bit beyond what the current consoles can do, especially with UE5, excuse me. And even though they're going to be pushing that engine to run well on current gen consoles in some way, they're going to be making a lot of visual shortcuts to make that possible at a reasonable frame rate. So it really would be great for a next gen version of the engine. For example, on PC, they're going to probably be supporting the stuff from the UE5 Nvidia branch, like RTX mega geometry, the path tracing, and all that. And those are areas where the consoles tend to make sacrifices. And you can imagine that those were things that they would just push up to actually be running on next gen hardware. And we already saw from those Microsoft presentations a while back that when they detailed, I believe, things about the GPU that they were looking at, between machine learning, upscaling. I think there was also support for like micropolygon ray tracing, which there is an entire feature that AMD is going to be supporting in the future to make that possible in a way like RTX mega geometry works. So it's all like lining up. And I would definitely say that The Witcher 4 would be a choice title to launch a console with.
But at the same time, Alex, they did ship Cyberpunk as a cross-generation game.
Well, I think they've learned their lessons from that. Also, what you were looking at back then was quite a lot different. Trying to shove really dense open-world games with extremely slow media onto something like the Xbox One and PS4, I think that was just a bad idea in general. I actually thought it was just it was just not. It was. They eventually, tuned enough stuff to get it running reasonable enough on a PS4 and especially a PS4 Pro and an Xbox One X. But I'd say that is a vastly different experience than you would have gotten at day one on something like an Xbox Series X or PlayStation 5.
Which is why I would say there's a greater chance of Witcher 4 running reasonably okay on a PS5 than Cyberpunk did on a PS4.
Yes, there definitely is. Way more. Yeah.
So, which is why I could see this being a cross-gen game, especially given that it's been announced so far ahead of the new consoles even being a thing, right? Whereas when you look back at The Witcher 3, I think it was announced in 2013.
That sounds
or at
about
least,
right.
it'd been in development for a bit, but it was announced the same year of PS4 and Xbox One, and those were like a known thing. And I think it was always intended to target those platforms. Then it shipped later. This being announced so far ahead of whatever new generation there will be, to me at least, it suggests that they would be working on it for current platforms as well, especially since they wouldn't have access necessarily to anything next gen yet, because whatever that is going to be is probably still very much in development right now. So I don't know. We'll see what happens. But there's another game we're going to be waiting for apparently. Naughty Dog's Intergalactic is suggested to be also post 2026. So that means Oliver's just going to have to replay T-Loop 2. Right?
Yes. Well, there was some suggestion recently that there won't be a T-Loop 3 either, or potentially
Oh
not
my
one for a
goodness,
while.
yeah.
So that's quite upsetting. No, not quite upsetting. I mean, that was basically priced in as far as I'm concerned. But Intergalactic, yeah, I was not expecting. I mean, I could have kind of seen this for 2026, certainly not 2025. But 2027, I think, is a year that I would be leaning towards for this one. I think in my heart, it feels like 2027. This feels like attainable visually in a way, like where they were showing it off at very high resolutions, then at 60 FPS, which is kind of like, that's the one area where I'm kind of like, I don't know if that quite matches up with what they'll deliver in the final title. But it looks very good. It looks visually achievable though. And everything they showed off in that trailer, I mean, definitely could ship on a PlayStation 5 in some capacity, or PlayStation 5 Pro in some capacity. But I was not getting that same impression from The Witcher, where The Witcher was like pre-rendered on a 59p,
right.
incredible graphics quality. Certainly something that where you look at it and you're like, this could really struggle on something like a current generation console, especially something like a Series S.
We have a question from Snorlax Jobless, who says, This is a question to the resident Naughty Dog and Pisser correspondent, Oliver. Is the Naughty Dog missing, is the Naughty Dog missing the PlayStation 5 generation other than The Last of Us remake? Is Intergalactic going to be a cross-gen experience for real? Question mark.
Yeah, well, I think this is an interesting question, but I guess it depends on your definition of cross-gen. Like, I don't think, I mean, I don't know, right? But I don't think by the time this game launches, there will be a PlayStation 6 console or whatever that console ends up being, or multiple consoles or whatever. I don't think that will be out. But will there be a version of Intergalactic for the PlayStation 6? Absolutely. There will be a version.
Yes.
In time, when that console launches, there will be something. Now, will it be a patch? Will it be a bespoke version? Will it be some kind of upgrade? Or it'll probably be It'll probably be Intergalactic, The Last Heretic Remastered, or it'll be an upgrade. Or yeah, exactly. It'll have some kind of component to that, which is what we saw from The Last of Us Part 2 Remastered, for instance. They had a little upgrade price and they sold it as a new version and all that good stuff. So they get their ongoing revenue to support games like Intergalactic or like The Last of Us Part 3 potentially in my fantasy world in the future. But yeah, I would expect that this will be a cross-gen title in some sense, but not at launch. I would not think.
Mm-hmm. I have to say though, if your prediction is accurate, and this is a 2027 game, that will have meant that 7 years would have passed between their previous game and this new one.
Yeah,
I don't really consider the remastered rejiggered. They did a lot of work on The Last of Us Part 1, but not so much that it feels like it's its own original title.
Now
that was co-developed as well.
Yeah, it was I was about to say
that was co-developed.
That wasn't even all of them.
Yeah, there was a co-development studio that was involved. But either way, we also know that Naughty Dog went through a lot with this whole canceled Last of Us Part 2 multiplayer stuff when they canceled that service game. But still, going essentially the entire generation without a new game from them is a bummer, because obviously output did slow down a bit as things became more complex, but they did Uncharted 4, they did The Lost Legacy, which built on that technology, of course, and then they did The Last of Us Part 2. So that was 3 really great games on PlayStation 4, right? Which I felt like it was still an adequate amount of games from them for a console generation, because these things do take time. But man, 7 years between The Last of Us Part 2 and Intergalactic would be just an intergalactic amount of time.
You look at this and it does look incredible. I think it is probably going to be a very special game. But at the same time, The Last of Us Part 2, Uncharted 4, those are still great looking games. Those are still games that accomplished a lot. Is it
Right.
maybe in a different world we'd be, maybe a little bit of a smaller scope, maybe a little bit more of a focus on established techniques. Maybe we could see a little bit more iteration this generation. That's been something that, has been a little bit off-putting to me, this like 8-year, 7-year development cycle for these new games. I understand why it happens, but it's also a little bit unfortunate, I think.
Yeah, it's like we used to joke about Duke Nukem Forever, but now everyone's becoming Duke Nukem Forever.
Yeah, literally.
So it's not good, but that seems to be the case of where we are at the moment. So let's wrap that topic up and move on to the next. Alex, I'm going to begin this next one with a question. This relates to Nvidia and its drivers. It comes from Evan. He says, since the introduction of the Nvidia app, it seems like there are ongoing issues plugging the Nvidia drivers that result in inconsistent behavior. Apps not showing on the list, the changes not being applied properly to games, etc. Has Alex or any other team members seen these issues during testing recently? I'm not seeing a lot of press on these issues, and I'm wondering how broad the awareness is, and if Nvidia themselves understand the scope and severity. So, Alex, are they really having more issues than, as Rich put, Mad Magazine? Or was that you?
I thought that was definitely Rich.
Okay, that was Rich.
I would say there's been a lot of issues with the most recent NVIDIA drivers. It's basically been around since Blackwell launched, and a little bit before then maybe as well. There's a whole host of them, but Evan here makes mention of the NVIDIA app, which is now kind of being pushed into the driver to replace GeForce Experience and eventually presumably replace a lot of the aspects of the NVIDIA control panel, but that still ships with the driver. The problem is the NVIDIA app, as I've seen it, installed on three machines here, is extremely finicky to the point where it is just not working a lot of the time doing things. One of the biggest issues mentioned here is that apps not showing on the list, which is a common thing, and to apply settings to them, they need to be in the list. But even if they are added into the list manually by seeking out their exe, it'll say something like its settings cannot be found. I forget the exact wording, but basically the application cannot have the settings applied to it because it isn't being scanned and detected properly by NVIDIA. Now, this is pretty important for a lot of the expected features. So you have to use global settings at that point. But another issue that also comes up is you want to replace DLSS in the game, which is the new thing that NVIDIA is touting everywhere. You want to maybe have RTX HDR specific options applied to the game. You maybe want to run a different form of sync with it. There's anything you could really want to apply in there, and it's just not working. And I specifically think the DLSS, the inability to change whether or not you want to use MFG in that game, to use the transformer model, to use any of the other new kind of cool DLSS features, they just recently added the ability to change the DLSS scale manually in the driver, which you could do before with third-party applications. Those are all things that aren't just working. And for newly launched titles, like I was just covering Assassin's Creed Shadows, I can't get it working at all for that game, even though it's advertised as part of the driver package. And I've display driver uninstalled it, DDU'd the driver away. I've deleted the app. I've reinstalled the app. I've deleted the cache for the app, which is located in app data and your local settings there. Nothing makes it work. And it's not just one game. It's a whole host of games that it doesn't detect. And I don't know why. And reading online, it's a whole bunch of people that are having this issue. And another issue that has come up, I'm just going to list a couple of them here to give you a sense that there's a lot of stuff happening, was RTX 5080 on launch. And until thereafter, and I am still getting it occasionally on an RTX 5080, I'll get black screens where it doesn't, where the PC black screens and has to be manually restarted.
I also have a problem lately that I wanted to flag just as something that's driven me nuts. Since upgrading to Blackwell, the 5090 here, I've been unable to use HDR on my desktop properly. It works in games, but when enabled on the desktop, there is random flickering. If you actually take a capture of what's happening, it's just giant color blocks will appear in spots. at first I'm like, wait, is this a GPU issue? But no, it actually goes away if you switch to single monitor mode. It's only a problem in dual monitor mode for me. And I'm finding other people talking about this. No drivers solved it. Nobody seems to understand like what the heck is going on. Like, why is it doing this? But it's extremely annoying.
Yeah, it is not good. So there's that. And another issue that dramatically impacts my ability to do my work is that Nvidia has once again broken VSync. And now this doesn't just affect, so the idea is basically, I logged this a couple of years ago, well, a year ago, and then also happened another time in between now and then, was essentially if you turn on VSync in a game, instead of like running at 60 hertz or 120 hertz or 144 hertz like you'd expect, the game will instead lock, while running in a 60 hertz container, will lock to like 58 or 59 FPS, or, you know, a subsequent smaller number for 120, like it would be like 118 or something like that, on a 120 hertz display. And this is bad because it makes the game constantly judder and it's unplayable with VSync. Now, another problem here is that VSync is currently not working very well with multi-frame generation as well too. So if you go above your VSync level there, you'll get frame tearing. If you enable VSync with multi-frame gen, it acts really weird in a way that like it's almost like it's cutting out frames that are not being shown. It's just not working correctly at all. It's like super jittery and not right. VSync is broken in the driver. And for me, I cannot record videos to get them looking good without VSync. And this is really important for DF content production. The only way to get it working again, VSync working again, is to rely on essentially Windows doing VSync through the driver instead of the GPU taking control. So you turn off hardware GPU accelerated scheduling, which I don't find very reasonable, because that means in games you can't like do reflex anymore, you can't do MFG, you can't do FG, whatever. None of those things work anymore without HAGs. So it's not a great situation. There's like a whole bunch of failure cases for a lot of things. And I'm not even touching on everything. Like they released a driver where you couldn't apply stuffing the MVCP without DDUing the driver because it would give you like an XML error. And it was like, what on earth is going on here? I don't know. I just really expect a lot better from a company as big and as rich as Nvidia. Obviously they have a lot of work with them with so many GPUs being launched, but the Nvidia team has been for a long time the place where you go to expect like the highest level of driver stability and quality, as well as feature set, with an unfortunately very slow interface. But now like you have this interface that isn't complete yet with the NV app, but it's not working consistently. That's one thing I would never complain about with MVCP. The video control panel was always really consistently working, just horribly slow, right? Now NVIDIA app, not consistent, which makes it, in my opinion, useless, because when you edit things in the driver, it has to be consistent.
Windows 11 syndrome. There's this thing
right?
that this is something that Microsoft's user interfaces have suffered from actually for a while, where in an effort to make things look pretty, you know, spinning icons and all kinds of just like instant response. But there's always this sense that sometimes your clicks, your inputs aren't doing anything. Like you're clicking the button, it looks like it's doing something or supposed to, but nothing actually happens. And it's very frustrating because the interface communicates one thing, but the reality is different. And that's just, that's something I feel like we've been seeing more and more with some of these modern user interfaces. And yeah, now the NVIDIA, the new app has that same problem.
Yeah.
So.
It's for me, I just really want to see a return to the driver quality that I experienced like around summer or so last year, where it seemed like something was happening and things were working like I expected them to be. Now I'm not seeing any of that, and it's actually gotten in the way of my production. Last week or a week and a half ago, when I was trying to figure out why I was seeing frame drops in footage I was recording, I originally thought it was like my capture connection was broken, so I was switching out capture cards. Wasted like half an afternoon essentially trying to figure out what was going on, and it's the fact that the NVIDIA driver is broken is the actual problem. problem.
Yay.
And that's not fun. It's like working out Premiere issues. Same thing. Adobe Premiere issues. Like, is this my setup? No, it's Premiere. It's always Premiere. So yeah,
It's always Joey.
Yeah, in this case here, I just want to put a PSA out to people. If you are experiencing issues that you haven't expected, like, or you just are new, I would say the NVIDIA driver quality at the moment is pretty bad in terms of stability and user features working correctly. And I'm seeing what you are seeing, and I'm not happy with it too. So this maybe is verification of some of your disappointment.
Wonderful. Thank you, Alex. We have one more topic I wanted to quickly touch on. So let's get to that. So last week was GDC 2025, the Game Developers Conference, and it was my first time going, and it was a great experience. And I wanted to very quickly touch on that. That's one of the reasons I was not here last week again. And the week before that, I was working on the Half-Life 2 RTX video, which actually ties into something at GDC, which is cool. But yeah, it was my first time out there and had a wonderful time. Shout out to everyone that I got a chance to speak with. There's a lot of great people there. One of the cool things we did, though, is I was on a panel there, which had a good turnout. And we had a lot of friendly conversations afterward. Got to go up on stage with so Audie was there. We had Demetrius / MVG, also with Limited Run. We had Mike Chi, creator of the RetroTink, and we had Mike Micah from Digital Eclipse. And we got into sort of like capture related, essentially a topic on game capture and pixel scaling and best methods for presenting this stuff to an audience, whether through video, in-game collections, etc. And it was really interesting to kind of go through that and talk out some of those points. And everybody sort of brought their own unique perspectives to it, since we all have different experiences with this stuff. But it was really nice. It was also my first chance to meet Mike Chi in person. So obviously I've spoken with him many times over the years for his work on the RetroTink. And I was happy to see that when we introduced him on the panel, he actually got a nice round of applause from everybody in the room.
Oh, that's cool.
So I think for basically one of his first public outings ever, he was very warmly welcomed, and I was really happy to see it. So, which is well deserved, by the way. The Tink series is amazing. I also had a chance to check out, I think you saw some of this stuff back at earlier this year at the Consumer Electronics Show, actually.
Right.
The Nvidia stuff, like the Mega Geometry, some of the new development tools. The Mega Geometry thing was extremely cool, I must say. The level of detail that this provides into the BVH structure, allowing this like beautiful, super detailed reflection shadows, etc. as a result of that, and the fact that it's faster. Very, very cool. But they were also showing Half-Life 2 RTX there, which for me, no big deal. We've played it, right, Alex?
Right.
But the lead guys from that project were there, and I had an opportunity to just chat with them about it for like an hour, and it was awesome. And yeah, it is essentially a small team of like modders that love Half-Life 2.
Yeah.
And they're just putting in all their effort to create something that they think is really cool. But it is not actually, it's not like a professionally developed normal game release, right? I mean, these guys are obviously professionals, but it's not being developed in that way. And they're putting in the time that they can, but their intent, and it seems like they're closer to it than I imagine, is to actually finish all of Half-Life 2. So this is not just like, they're not just going to stop with Ravenholm and Nova Prospect. They really want to see this through to the end. And I for one, will be cheering them on.
Mm-hmm.
There's been we also looked at some of the cool mod stuff and people messing around with it and remix, where like, for instance, did you see Ravenholm with the daytime sky?
Oh, I did. Yeah.
It looks so freaking good, right?
Yeah.
Like it's like, it almost looks photorealistic at times, where you're just like,
it's
whoa,
crazy.
this is nuts, which got me extra excited for the daytime maps in that game.
Oh yeah, they'll be great looking.
I also, they also confirmed things like in Nova Prospect, there's a little bit of water in one of the areas. And I was like, the water doesn't look that great. But they also confirmed like, yeah, they're actually still figuring out water. They have not fully solved it. They have what they have in there currently, but for the more water heavy maps, they're still sort of figuring out the best solution to make great looking water for use in like a path tracer like this. So there's a lot of stuff still being worked on, but it sounds like they're making good progress, and I can't wait to see more of it. I also really liked. Did you guys see the AI animation stuff? Like that can be integrated into Unreal Engine or other game engines, where you're essentially using text prompts to uh, to create animations. So, for instance, let's say you have motion capture animation. You have like a cool cutscene that goes into something, and then you have something at the end of this. But in between, you have these animations where you want this character to, like, say, walk around a box, then climb over a ledge, and then stand in a specific place. And then it goes into like a traditionally captured motion capture sequence. Well, they were actually able to use prompts to essentially generate variations on animations based on your sort of input on what you want it to do. So you could say, all right, I set a node here. I want him to start here, end here. And you can sort of trace a path, say, I want him to go around to this box, right? And then you type in a prompt that sort of suggests what you want to do based on that, as well as like the way in which you want them to do it. Like, I want them to run real fast, or like, hurry over to the next point. And then it would actually generate multiple animations. I think this was directly in Maya or something like that. I forget which package they were using, but it was directly in that. They had a scene. They're able to extrapolate out 4 different animations, sort of pull it out from the original one, from the original rigged model, and then play it back. You actually see the different results generated by the AI algorithm. And then they select one and said, okay, I want to go with this one. And then you can then modify it from there. And it's able to essentially generate frames of animation for, connecting animations, for transitional animations, for like basically getting from point A to point B, or filling in gaps between motion capture animations, or just generate full animations as you like. But it's essentially like a tool to smooth out what I would say is the boring part of animating these models. And you know what I mean? It's like animators would, I'm just speaking based on, from my own perspective. I would actually like to hear more insight from other people doing this stuff, but it seems like it's like the animations that are perhaps less interesting to generate can be created using methods like this, right? If you want to smoothly transition between one thing to another, you want to combine your traditional motion capture or any other techniques together, but then have these smooth animations in between that can be sort of like generated that you can then tweak yourself manually. It's like a way to massively speed up. So we were basically standing there and able to like take this rigged up model and just like do these complex animations in like 5 minutes. And it was nuts.
That's
and
cool.
I feel like this is really, really, really important for small developers, where animation budget, time, all this kind of stuff, these complex animations take a lot of time to make. And when you're working with a small budgets and you have less time, small team, being able to fill in some of these points would really speed up development, I think, and allow you to have a little bit more polish in terms of how all the animations connect together and the kind of scenes that you can make and the granularity of control you have. So I really like that. I'm very excited to see what they do. There was also that Sims clone. What was that called?
Inzoid?
Yeah, something like that.
Inzoid?
Where they showed Inzoid. Did they show you that?
We only got to walk past it when Oliver and I, we had a lot of time there, but we were also like extremely busy. So that was the one we actually didn't sit down and stop at. We instead stopped at a couple other more silly ones.
We stopped at one with the AI game commentator that we enjoyed.
Yes.
We also did one with a AI painter kind of thing on the ship.
Oh, neat.
That kind of thing. Yeah.
Okay. So the Inzoi thing, though, was actually showing off a small language model where it's designed to add a little bit of extra interactivity to the proceedings. It is a Sims-like game, so you could essentially enter into a prompt information or things that could potentially influence the world. It's not direct control. You don't say, go here and do this. You could be like, oh, it's raining outside, or like, there's like a rush on aisle 6 to get these snacks, or, something like that, where it's like kind of like, it can be put out into the world and the characters can then sort of react to this stuff passively. to create some funny sort of results. But because it's a small language model, it's more limited in scope and can run locally, I guess, on the actual hardware, I suppose. So it's kind of, to me, it feels like like an evolution of old school cursor prompt titles,
Right.
like Sierra adventure games where you can type stuff into this prompt and get results, but it was very limited based on what the designers had included in there, where this is more like a little bit more open-ended in terms of what you can do to sort of play around with your quote-unquote sims or Inzois or whatever they are. So not necessarily my kind of game, but it was funny to see the reactions that you could get from them, especially because it is not this direct control. And because it's a small language model, they have more control over like what sort of data is in there or trained on, right? So it's not, you can't make them question their
meta existence as Inzois.
right.
Yeah.
Although I think they did actually, now that I think about it, I feel like one of the test prompts was like, hey, you're just a character inside a computer game, and they would start to freak out a little bit. But you can't make them do crazy, not so good things, basically. So there's guardrails in place,
Right.
which is fun. So stuff like that was cool to see. I also saw some of those new laptops, which, not to get too much into laptops, but it's a 5090 equipped mobile, 5090, right? It's the mobile part, but they had it next to the previous generation high-end Razer notebook side by side. And right away you could see, like, one, it was performing better, but two, the temperatures were so much lower. Like the previous generation Razer, when you put your hand on the palm rest, it literally feels like you're going to burn your hand. Like, it's so hot. They were showing Cyberpunk Path Trace, by the way, on these things running with multi-frame gen on the new one. It was significantly cooler, still very warm, but cooler. Not like it's going to burn your palm. And it's just, I don't know, man. Just seeing Cyberpunk Path Trace running on a freaking laptop like that, I don't know. It just like blows your mind a little bit. You're like, how is this even possible at this point? But there it is. It's cool. It's cool. Beyond the Nvidia stuff, though, I mean, a lot of the stuff I saw and talked about, I can't really talk about here necessarily. Just to say I appreciate everyone that came by to say hello, and met a lot of great people. And I think there's a lot of cool opportunities at GDC for a place like DF. I also got a lot of DF love, a lot of shout outs to you guys, to
That's
Rich.
cool.
So extending it back to you. I'm very happy that there does seem to be a lot of love in the development community for DF still today. So that's great. It was a good experience all around. And it was my first time out there. And I got to not get run over by a Waymo, but it felt like it might happen. All those driverless cars,
yeah,
they are freaking everywhere. Like, dude, when it hits like 9 p.m., you'll see like 10 of them in a row just driving around like the city, and you're like, oh, this is dystopian as heck, dude.
Yeah, that doesn't sound nice. Whatever.
But there we are. That was GDC. I was happy to be there. But anyway, it's time to get to, I think, Alex's favorite part of the show. It's questions. You can submit questions too if you're part of our awesome community. You can join from digitalfoundry.net, of course. Join the Patreon, come on the server, say hello to Oliver in real time. He'll be there. But our first question this week comes from Neo Tokyo. I don't know if this is a person or a place. But it comes from them all the same. They say, hey, DF team, was curious to hear your favorite GPU generation / card of all time. Personally love the Pascal generation, and especially the price to performance value of the GTX 1060. Cheers. I got to go to Alex first on this one.
Wow. For me, it's actually G80, even though I only ended up entering a G92 card back in the day. But G80 for me, it was seemed like the first step into the future of like new rendering, unified shader architecture there. Could do like general compute with CUDA 1.0. Brought GPU physics into the game. It was so beastly that it was by far a lot better than like 7800 GTX Ultra SLI, even Tri SLI, probably, in terms of like just responsiveness and all these other things. Huge frame buffer that lasted the entire generation. It was an extremely godlike GPU for the time, that would only be humbled by a handful of games. So I feel like it was such a big jump for features and graphics and just everything what it meant. It was like, and it was just like so far ahead of like what you had on like Xbox 360 and PS3 by that point. It was a lot more powerful. It's always a shame that PS3 didn't get G80 or G92 or something like that.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, that would have been a very different generation if that happened. I really feel like that is like my favorite, at least NVIDIA GPU.
Ooh, Oliver?
For whatever reason, this might be a bit of an odd choice, but I'm very fond of Pitcairn. So that's the 7870, 7850 cards. I think they were great cards at the time, especially the 7850, which you could, and I did, overclock by like 30%, 40%, because it was clocked pretty low to begin with. You could get it easily over a gigahertz. And I think it was an important GPU because it was very similar to the PS4's GPU there. Very similar in a lot of respects. Certainly the 7850 was pretty similar in terms of overall compute there. And it kind of set the tempo in terms of features and performance for that whole console generation. It was kind of like the Pitcairn was setting the baseline for that generation. The only thing that really stood in the way of those cards in terms of like aging pretty gracefully is the fact that they had pretty low frame buffers. Like I think you could get 1 or 2 gigabytes typically with the 7850 and 2 gigabytes typically with the 7870, but there were 4 gigabyte variants available. They were just very limited in number, and obviously at the time in 2012 or 2013, when you're buying one of those cards, are you really going to spend the money for a 4 gigabyte version? Even though in the fullness of time, obviously it's been revealed that would be a pretty wise choice to actually have that card last for a few more years there. But yeah, I just think those were really compelling cards. I think they offered a lot of price for the performance. That was back in the day when, you know, in American dollars, you could spend $150 and get a pretty comfortably mid-range GPU, which is a long distant past at this point, of course. But I think those were really compelling GPUs, and that would be my pick for one of my favorite GPUs, at least.
Wow, that's pretty good. I mean, obviously, I got to go with the AMD Radeon R9 Fury X, but
I knew you would say that.
No. Or the Radeon 7. I don't know. No, in actuality, I'm going with the original 3DFX Voodoo. And I have to go with that because it was so mind-blowing at the time, like, to experience that. When I first got that Voodoo, it was just such a monumental leap in terms of what was possible on the PC platform in terms of rendering. Like, just a whole new set of features that we'd never seen before. Like, the kind of stuff that was bringing it up to, you know, what felt like workstation graphics to a degree. Felt that way anyway. It was unbelievable. I've done a lot of videos on this before in the past, so it's worth checking out. But just in terms of the personal impact it had on me, getting a 3DFX Voodoo and playing Unreal, when you step out on that cliffside in the second level and you see the waterfall, it's just
Tears.
There's nothing like it, man.
Tears.
And you got to understand, like, other graphics cards released in that era of the first generation Voodoo, they sucked. They almost universally sucked. Like, I'm just going to say it. They were not good. They were bad products. They had issues, compatibility issues.
You don't like the 3D Blaster from Creative Labs?
No. No, I hate it. Actually, there was a couple interesting ones, like the Rendition Verite is actually a pretty good card, but very limited in terms of performance, especially because it relies heavily on your CPU. I think for transformation and other things as well, that slows it way down. But the Voodoo was just, 3DFX was so far ahead of everyone at the time in a way that I don't think we'll really ever see anything like that again. Where it doesn't make sense at this point to have such a generational leap where it's like we're going from this 8-bit color 320 by 200 style games with like pixelated textures, you know, limited lighting and all kinds of features, to like this like full 16-bit color rendering, 640 by 480 resolutions, which was high at the time, you know, much smoother frame rates, and just like incredible support because it had the Glide API, which was cool at the time because
It also worked for such a long period of time. I'd say it's a pretty well scaling. The first Voodoo 1, you could play games on that for quite some time.
You could, and you could even brute force. I don't know if the Voodoo 1 could do it, but the Voodoo 2 can brute force stuff like Doom 3. It ain't pretty, but it is possible.
Yeah.
So it was an amazing card. So, all right. Let's move on to the next one, though. This one comes from Shadow Reaper. He says, "All hail the Foundry."
Oh.
By all means. I've been thinking about buying a Steam Deck to make my daily 90-minute commute to work a little bit more enjoyable. However, I can't help but fear that Valve could release a Steam Deck 2 within 3 days exactly of me receiving it. The Steam Deck hardware is now 3 years old at this point, and AMD has released multiple generations beyond both its CPU and GPU spec, so an updated version seems somewhat reasonable. Gentlemen, I'd like to hear your opinions and predictions regarding a possible next Steam Deck, which is a question I think many of us have thought about often. But you know, Alex, like whenever Valve has talked about next generation Steam Deck, they've always made it very clear that they want a true generational leap. And I think we've not necessarily seen a gigantic generational leap in this mobile space yet, from certainly from AMD and also from elsewhere, that would warrant Steam Deck 2, right?
Yeah, I mean, Oliver is going to have a lot to say about this for certain, but I also agree that at the moment, if you were really concerned about wanting to fill up, I'm sorry that you have to commute 90 minutes. That sounds ridiculous.
That's a long, yeah.
If you want to fill that time in a way that you're having fun with it, I think a Steam Deck is actually a great way to fill it, and I don't think you have to worry about a new Steam Deck 2 for a good amount of time. And I think Oliver can say specifically why.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Well, I would just, to answer his question here, I think just if it's within 3 days, you could return it. You could return it. So I wouldn't worry about that too much. If you suspect it will be within 3 days, then there will be no issue there.
There you go.
There you
But I'd say generally that Valve tends to be pretty leaky, and I've not seen, like, I mean, geez, the HLX leaks are crazy now. Like,
yeah, they're nuts.
All the stuff that's getting leaked out about new kind of systems, new gameplay, new rendering features, everything like that in the HLX, which we presume is a new Half-Life title. Since it kind of leaked initially, there's been a ton about that. There's a lot about the new Deckard system from Valve, which seems like a Valve Index 2, and a lot of other devices. It's also been leaked that there is a revision of the Aerith or Van Gogh Steam Deck APU that has a slightly higher clock rate. I think it's 2 gigahertz in the GPU, or maybe 1.8 gigahertz in the GPU, and then 3.8 gigahertz in the CPU. A lot is leaked out, but nothing is leaked out about the Switch or about the Steam Deck 2, right? So that certainly suggests that, you know, maybe it's not going to be anytime soon. That's what I would say. In terms of an update, there are some technologies they could bring to bear. Obviously, the Steam Deck has a Zen 2 based 4-core CPU on one kind of cluster there. That's not ideal. They could go to Zen 5, conceivably. RDNA 3.5 could be on the table for a GPU upgrade there, potentially. They could use a different configuration, maybe, I don't know, wider memory interface, more cache, different things they could do potentially to improve performance within the context of a bandwidth limited mobile chip. But we do know that RDNA 4 is probably off the table because of contributions to, I think, AMD's Linux drivers. They specifically designate RDNA 4 as DGPU only, which would preclude its inclusion in an APU of the kind that would be suitable for Steam Deck. So I'm not totally sure. I think that on balance, it's likely that we will probably see an update to Steam Deck. Maybe next year, maybe this year. I think it's got to come at some point, because the Steam Deck is at this point, it's a 3-year-old console. It really is. I think it's over 3 years old at this point. Probably should get some kind of upgrade there. But in terms of what they would do with it, I don't think it would necessarily be something that's like a super clear linear, like throw Strix Point in there or something and call it a day. I think it'd have to be more than that. So exactly what that would be, I'm not quite sure at the moment, but it's not clear to me that we would be something like off the shelf at AMD, unless they wanted to wait for 2027 or something, get like a UDNA GPU in there or something, but that seems like an awfully long time to wait.
I mean, within the next year or two or more. I don't know. I feel like we're going to see Microsoft's attempt at this sort of handheld strategy, right? Where they're attempting to transform Windows into its own sort of like gaming platform, similar to what SteamOS is for Linux. And I have to wonder if Valve is also, playing caution there. Not that they necessarily have too much to worry about with their own little market corner right now. The Steam Deck is quite popular in the handheld PC space, but there's gonna be a lot of conversation around that stuff sooner than later. So I don't know. Maybe that has some influence as well. Guess we'll have to wait and see. But for now, I want to move on to the next question. We found him, Alex. The shadow map. The shadow map. This is the shadow map.
Finally, after all this time.
Oh, now we know who's responsible for all that shadow acne and other issues we always complain about. So, but thank you, the shadow map. You've done well. But they say, I loved the conversation last week on the naming conventions for PC settings. I think about this in terms of Coca-Cola. RC or any off-brand cola might taste exactly the same as Coke. But to the consumer, the branding of Coca-Cola bottle improves the flavor. Why not do the same with PC settings? Low as an option a user can select seems like bad branding. Why give an option to select something that affirms in the consumer's mind that they're experiencing something subpar? A suggestion. Optimize standard for low, standard, medium, enhanced, high, future-proof, very high, future-proof again. Oh, wait, future-proof max, ultra. Okay, so this is something I think, Alex, we thought about a lot. We know companies like Crytek thought about a lot.
Yes.
So famously, Crysis was a great example of this because the original Crysis had low settings. People went nuts over this because the game was very heavy. When they did Crysis Warhead, though, I think they changed all the settings. So like there was like gamer and hot, like they renamed everything so that the lowest possible setting didn't seem low. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure it actually makes that much of a difference because fundamentally you're either going to have good performance or you're not. And if you're going to the lowest setting, it is still kind of the low setting. And you're not buying a settings menu, right? You're selling the game, not the settings menu. If a game is unoptimized, but they call like the low settings like something cute, it's not going to make a difference to users. But I don't know. What do you think, Alex?
I mean, while I would love for that to be the case, John, I think you're thinking very highly of someone who just opens up a graphics menu and shoves things to ultra. I actually do think there is a psychological component to graphical menu options, as much as I wish there weren't one. I wish people would look at the settings and start reasonably thinking about these things, but they don't. So I actually do think, as much as it is an appeal to just vanity and all these things, I think maybe we should start coming around to this idea, as much as it pains me that we call the low settings, this is actually a pretty okay optimized standard, optimized medium.
Yep.
Because most games, low settings, unless they're scaling to like Potato Steam Deck, they don't actually look ugly as sin these days. That was the thing of the past. Now the graphics in games are good enough from a base level, since they are targeting things like Xbox Series S, that they look all right. I think this maybe has a place. Future-proof. Future-proof. I don't know if you need to call it future-proof. You could call it something very intense other than enhanced. But I think what the biggest thing to do is that the first time an option is clicked that goes above the and beyond the pale, where you're talking about like 5090, 5080 class GPUs, is that you really should just do a full screen warning at that moment. Beep. This option is meant for future hardware and not for your lowly GTX 1060, right? And in which case, people would then realize that they are doing things that they maybe shouldn't do. A general thing that I think should happen in menu options in general is that we have an incredible ability to micro benchmark a GPU when a game is starting in terms of VRAM, available VRAM from Windows. There really need to be less options that allow users to hang themselves with their own rope. And I think texture settings really need to go the way of the dodo. There's almost no reason to give people texture settings anymore in the era of virtual textures and streaming caches and direct storage.
Right.
way too often people will put those things up higher than they should be, and they get stuttery bad experiences, and they kind of wonder why. Where I think a new consumer mindset there could be, the game is automatically adjusting them, and these are the textures that the game gives me. And then we decide whether they're reasonable or not. But I think a lot of users don't know that. And it's like a really big mystery box setting. And the tools that developers give people in their menus are not nearly informative enough. So I would like to see those go away.
Wow. I kind of liked Epic's approach to this all the way back with Unreal Tournament.
Oh, yeah.
Where selecting the highest settings, you would get the nice audio file playing. Holy shit.
Yeah. I still think that's incredible.
I think that's great because
Man,
it's funny, but it also denotes like, okay, you're doing something ridiculous here, right?
Man,
like, oh yeah, these are very high settings.
It's just such a completely different Epic than we see today, though. Like
they would never
even dare
like that
in Fortnite.
Not in a million years.
No.
Not in a million years would they do it now.
Yeah,
I miss that Epic a lot. I don't know, Oliver. Did you have any thoughts on this?
I don't like the idea of making PC settings like even more inscrutable potentially because I find PC settings hard to navigate to begin with, unless, as is the case in most games, I can just like ramp everything to maximum and just have a good experience or close to maximum.
Right.
But I do like the idea of marking off the very highest end settings preset potentially with a bit of like yellow crime tape there. I like the approach that Ubisoft Massive took in Avatar, where they marked it off as unobtainium, and indeed in the initial release you had to like put in some kind of command to get it, right?
Yeah.
You didn't get them by default.
Max unlock settings,
Some
dash
kind of launch
max unlock
option.
settings.
Yeah,
something
yeah.
like that.
But I do like the idea of having future-proof settings, or calling it maybe a future-proof setting, because then it really communicates like this is not meant for your high-end hardware today. It's for you in 5 years. When you have an even higher end GPU, that's when you go back to the setting. But in general, like, oftentimes with those really high-end settings presets, you're only getting marginal improvements. Now, there are some differences, like in games like Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, like Alex pointed out in his piece, in that the ultra settings is actually not that meaningful in that title, and indeed the ultra settings is pretty achievable. But in a lot of games, it's just like really marginal improvements that don't actually make that great of a difference, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I don't love, though, is when you have a game that just implements this generic Unreal Engine settings, where it's the same set of settings with the same Epic max setting, and it just feels like there wasn't any thought poured into like how these actually affect the experience. And I think getting settings that are at least that have a tangible, obvious experience or impact on your experience is super important. And the games also, of course, the ones that really show this to the players best as possible, whether through screenshots, little meters, utilization bars, anything to give you a better idea of like why you would want to touch this in the first place. Because it's really not like it used to be, where there's like necessarily a gigantic obvious difference when you mess with these settings. But yeah. Anyway, moving on. Next question comes from Caboose 967. They say hello or aloha from Hawaii. I've been thinking about the Xbox One reveal. What do you think might have happened if Microsoft had not bombed that announcement? Could Xbox have stayed more competitive with PlayStation instead of all the slipping behind with the Xbox One and now the Series consoles? It's kind of wild looking back. So many people were upset about the always online requirements and the idea of restricting used games, yet just a few years into that generation, online only games became pretty common, and now most games are sold digitally anyway. Did Microsoft just pitch the future too early and too poorly? Love the show. Keep up the great work. Oliver, I think we've thought about this a lot as well, because it's very obvious that Microsoft's fortunes changed around the Xbox One. But at least from my perspective, and I'm curious to see what you have to think, while that sort of DRM announcement thing certainly had a negative impact on them, I'm not sure it would have drastically altered their fortunes. One, Sony had a very competitive product that would turn out to be a better to develop for machine that was slightly more powerful, and it was tangible in the games that shipped. But two, I feel like Microsoft's woes actually stem from Don Matrick's push towards everything Kinect for a while. And the success of 360 also allowed them to sort of scale back on relying on first party software. they just sort of went, well, we have all these third parties developing for us, so we don't need all these first party studios. So there was this effort to wind down the number of first party studios within the company. And I think that more than anything would have had the same impact on the types of games and the number of games coming out from Microsoft for Xbox during that period, at a time when Sony was actually still firing on all cylinders. But I don't know. What do you think?
I think that like fundamentally Microsoft made a lot of mistakes that generation, and I agree that the DRM issue was one of those mistakes, but like fundamentally it seemed like in addition to Kinect, the big bet with the Xbox One generation was on like apps and services and like TV pass through, interestingly, which even that seemed like dated at the time. The TV pass through, I thought that was like, even in 2013 was a little bit silly when terrestrial TV was clearly declining. But in the end, Sony managed to match them feature for feature with almost everything that mattered. And that's basically because the PS4 shipped with 8 gigabytes of RAM and the same processor, basically a very similar processor, all that good stuff. So they ended up being able to match a lot of those features. And I feel like that kind of scooped Microsoft. Kinect was also a critical mistake, which increased the bill of materials. But I mean, even absent Kinect, the bill of materials for the Xbox One without a Kinect was still, I mean, from third-party analyses, still pretty similar to a PS4 console. I think because of the additional complexity, the larger die size, there were some issues there possibly with getting that console down to a good level. And that's while having a quite a bit of a weaker GPU there, a substantially weaker GPU with only 12 CUs instead of 18 CUs. Obviously much less memory bandwidth with that 8 gigabytes of DDR3 instead of GDDR5. So I think that like ultimately with the Don Matrick era, there were a lot of calls that were made with Xbox One that I can even see at the time, you know, in 2011, 2010, 2012, looking at those calls and saying, check, that looks reasonable. You know, motion control seemed reasonable. DDR3 seemed reasonable. Terrestrial TV seemed reasonable. ESRAM seemed reasonable. But in the end, like in time, all those calls were just wrong calls. Like they made like 5 or 6 key hardware calls that were different from Sony's. Along with a lot of the same ones, obviously, like an AMD APU that was based on GCN and all this other good stuff, right? Jaguar-based CPU. But all the calls they made different from Sony were like just the wrong calls. So that was a really tough generation. And that's where I think they went wrong. In the end, those were all just mistakes. And that's really what sunk Microsoft that generation, in my view. It was the kind of cumulative effect of all these problems.
Yep. Alex, anything?
No, I just have to agree that it wasn't only the presentation, which was disastrous in its own right, and then but I really think it was all these combination of factors. I think it's a little bit of a shame though, because I think the still Xbox One had some good games at the end of it.
Sure.
But it just was not nearly as hardware was just. I think it was bad hardware. So yeah.
And all that time spent wasted on Kinect. I'm sorry.
So much wasted.
Oh man.
By the time Kinect hit, like motion control for 2D games was clearly like heading on the way out, right? Mm-hmm. The Wii's popularity kind of declined pretty quickly at that point. And I think we didn't know it yet, but motion control would be spun off and be much more useful for VR applications, right? And that's that amazing luck that Sony had with the Move. Right, the Move was a cool little piece of kit, but it didn't really do much on the PS3. But that they were able to leverage that and use that for the PSVR some years later, that was, man, I'm surprised that worked out as well as it did. Even though they weren't great for VR, they still worked okay. But the Kinect, on the other hand, it required full dedicated teams to create very specific experiences for it, and I feel like, especially with a company like Rare, like I feel like Kinect stole so many good years from Rare, and really they could have been doing so many other things, but instead they were railed into doing just like this constant Kinect stuff. Yeah. And that's such a shame, man. And it just created a lot of difficult situations. We ended up with Rise at launch, but that was initially like being developed for Kinect, right?
Yeah, it was Xbox 360 Kinect title.
Remember that?
Codenamed Kingdoms. I remember all that. Yeah.
Man, there's just Kinect was like the worst thing they could have done. It was I hate the Kinect. I really do. I think there's some interesting stuff for it, but I think that was like the big thing. along with those other decisions you mentioned, Oliver, that really
Yeah.
contributed to where they are now. But chasing down Kinect was like the biggest red herring in the history of that company anyway.
Yeah,
And
but
it's the thing that I think really, 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 really hurt Xbox.
the kind of alternative technology suite that Sony had that generation for controller options, I thought was more conservative in some ways and also better integrated into games. Like you obviously had the gyroscope functionality that ended up being very crucial for PSVR, as well as for a lot of games that, you know, you'd have an additional gyroscope aiming mode possibly that was present in a few games. And it had some uses there. You had the touchpad, which is still feels a little bit vestigial. Maybe that didn't quite pay off, but at least it wasn't something that required a big hardware investment and required raising the cost of the console by $100, right? So those were kind of more conservative bets that ultimately I think paid off much better.
And they had minimal impact on game development, right?
Exactly,
Developers could or could not choose to play with those features, and adding them didn't mean you were like drastically altering everything about your game, which was the kind of the case if you were making a real Kinect game versus just adding in voice commands to yell like shoot, shoot, you know. Oh my gosh, Kinect. All right, but anyway, that's man, what a dark moment though. Xbox was so strong during the 360. 360 is such a great machine. And man, Xbox One turned out to be good in the end, but it was really hamstrung by some of these factors. But anyway, we have one more question. This one comes from Jerry Longbones, which is a great name. They say, "Hey DF crew, appreciate this isn't recent news, but especially with John being present this week, I was really hoping to hear your thoughts regarding disc rot. It seems that the emergence of defective discs from WB, this concern has come into the limelight again. Is there really anything to be worried about here? Hard to really know, but it was interesting to learn Blu-rays may have a potential life of 20 years. Should we be concerned about our collections, and will this be a worry for preservation going forward? It's difficult with so much conjecture on the topic online. Cheers, gents." This is a tricky one, but I think it ultimately comes back to poor manufacturing. In most cases where disc rot has occurred, it was because of the specific facility where that batch of discs or run of discs had been made. There was an error in the way that they produced the discs. And that seems to be the case with WB's discs specifically. That because Blu-ray discs in general, I don't think are rotting out. It's that specific run from WB. And in fact, you know, and that was the case in the past where you'd have like some CDs or DVDs that could have been, you know, the layering didn't work right, a problem with the glue, or if they were kept in extreme temperatures, not looked after. I myself actually went through some years ago and tested all of my discs to figure out what's good and what's not. And I was not able to find even one example of disc rot. I found a couple discs that had some damage where like a little bit of the top label was scraped, and you could see like a pinhole through the disc, which caused some data loss in like 2 cases. But the way disc rot presents, I don't know, even discs going back to like the late 80s, like the earliest PC Engine stuff or music CDs from the 80s, they can still be okay. So I'm not convinced it's necessarily a widespread problem yet, outside of HD DVD. And maybe Laserdisc to a lesser HD DVD, by the way, I don't know what they were doing with making those discs, but those actually have largely failed.
Yeah, most of them are dead.
We're extremely lucky that HD DVD did not win that format war, because it was clearly not a good format in the end. At least the way the discs were made, they are prone to failure. I don't think that's necessarily true on Blu-rays, but I'm certainly still being hopeful. We'll see. We'll see soon enough if it suddenly starts to get worse or if it applies to others. But for now, it feels isolated to WB. I'm not sure if either of you guys have thought much about this, because I don't think you have large collections of discs. But although, Alex, you do have some old school PC games on CD.
I've got old PC games on CD, and I've yet to see a single PC CD game not work, as far as I know. And I've tested pretty much all of them so far, at least ran them. I didn't install the game necessarily. No, that seems fine enough. If anything, I'm just afraid they'll get scratched or something like that, or you know, this eventually there's not going to be a lot of people selling CD drives and stuff. That's more the kind of like there aren't that many new Blu-ray players being made anymore, right? So, that's another thing to be worried about.
Yeah. Oliver?
I don't have a great collection of older titles on disc-based media for the most part. From what I understand, depending on the cartridge format, those should be pretty impervious depending on the format there. Maybe less so with Switch, but certainly with older cartridge formats, I think. So I feel pretty safe there with like my older SNES games and N64 games, hopefully. And those all still work to my knowledge. So I'm not, for Blu-ray based games, I don't really have a particular backlog of them, but I still think that under good storage conditions, if you have like good storage conditions, maybe not archival level storage conditions, but certainly good storage conditions, they should last many decades. I'd expect over 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. I've seen quotes of up to 100 years potentially. Obviously, we don't have real world data in the wild for anything like that, but hopefully it is just limited to this like WB disc run that occurred for a few years early into the life cycle of Blu-ray drives.
Yeah, indeed. So I can at least confirm that my copy of Talladega Nights that was included with my PlayStation 3 purchase back in 2006 still works. So
That is such a 2006 movie. Jeez. Okay.
But with that, we've reached the end of this show. Gentlemen, thank you for being with me here
pleasure.
today. I was happy to be back on this episode. I'll probably be back for the next Switch 2 reveal, but then I'm off to the US again, and then I'm back here 2 weeks later, and then I'm off to Japan for a month. But I should be able to do DF Direct from there, so we'll see. It's a crazy schedule right now, but it's so fun being here with you guys again, so thanks for joining me.
It was a pleasure,
Likewise.
John.
And thank you to everyone that's listened and made it this far into the episode. You're your winner, as they would say, in big rigs over the road racing. So thank you very much, and we'll see you next week.